Greetings, night owls and quiet doubters. Tonight we pull back the curtain on history's outrageous conspiracy theories, once dismissed, then terrifyingly revealed as undeniably true. Prepare to question tinfoil hats and secrets. The rabbit hole, my dear friends, is real. If this journey into hidden truth sparks your curiosity, please like and subscribe. It supports our quiet expeditions into history, stranger than fiction, as we gather and tell us in comments, where are you and what time is it? Fascinating to connect. Now, dim the lights, blanket closer, let's ease into tonight's unsettling history. The phrase conspiracy theory often conjures a very distinct image, doesn't it? Shadowy figures, elaborate diagrams, and what many politely term creative thinking. For decades, these words became shorthand for ideas deemed outlandish, far-fetched, not worth serious consideration. They're relegated to the fringes, the stuff of late-night forums and hushed whispers, too easily dismissed with a knowing smile. This immediate skepticism isn't entirely unfounded. Many such notions indeed lack a solid basis in verifiable fact. It's a label that often invites ridicule more than careful reflection. Many notions branded conspiracy theories are imaginative leaps, not evidence-based conclusions. The allure of a hidden, grand explanation for complex events is powerful, leading to narratives that crumble under scrutiny. This reality has fostered a societal distrust of anything hinting at clandestine plots by those in power. Yet while a discerning eye is crucial, can this reflexive dismissal cause us to overlook uncomfortable truths? Might the label itself become a potent shield, deflecting inquiry from genuinely covert actions, from history that hasn't been fully told or accepted yet by the mainstream? Let's consider conspiracy, stripped of sensationalism. It's fundamentally a secret plan by a group for unlawful or harmful ends. History, read closely and without prejudice, is no stranger to such events. From ancient courts to modern corridors of power, groups have sought to achieve aims in secret, sometimes outside law or public morality. Powerful entities, governments, corporations, influential cabals, have at times engaged in coordinated efforts shielded from public view for specific, often self-serving purposes. This sober reality is key as we begin our exploration tonight. The official narrative, the version from authorities, often forms our initial understanding. Frequently this is accurate or compiled in good faith. However, history also shows official accounts can be incomplete, sometimes deliberately so for various reasons. Information might be suppressed or managed to protect interests, maintain stability, or avoid accountability. Secrecy is a potent tool for those with influence, letting plans unfold without unwelcome scrutiny. This isn't speculation, it is a documented pattern, a recurring theme in the story of human governance. This brings us to the shifting sands of truth. What one generation dismisses as a wild, unfounded theory, another might unearth as fully documented fact. Information slowly gets declassified over time. Whistleblowers, often at great personal risk, emerge. Journalists doggedly pursue faint leads for years. Slowly, painstakingly, pieces of a once-hidden puzzle surface. The dominant narrative changes. Ideas once crazy or paranoid can transition by sheer weight of evidence into accepted historical events. The line between perceived madness and acknowledged reality is not always fixed, nor easily drawn. It is crucial, then, to clarify our precise purpose in this quiet exploration. We are not venturing into baseless speculation or uncorroborated claims. Our focus is steadfastly on events once dismissed as mere conspiracy theories, but since substantiated by credible, verifiable evidence. Declassified documents, official government admissions, or rigorous investigative journalism, we tread the firm ground of verified history, albeit the kind that took considerable time and bravery to bring fully into the light. These are not tales from conjecture, but confirmed chapters of our shared past, waiting to be calmly examined. A healthy skepticism is an invaluable tool for navigating our complex world and its constant flow of information. It protects from deception and encourages vital, critical thought. However, this skepticism should ideally be paired with an equally open mind, a willingness to examine evidence even if it challenges our deeply held, preconceived notions or our comfortable understanding of how things should operate. The stories we will delve into are potent reminders that truth can indeed be stranger and sometimes more profoundly unsettling than fiction. They show that powerful groups can, and demonstrably do, act in concert, in secret, with profound and lasting consequences. So, as we prepare to explore these now verified accounts, let us do so with a calm, deeply investigative spirit. This journey isn't about sensationalism or undue alarm, but a thoughtful, measured look at historical moments where the unbelievable eventually became the undeniable truth. Fitting for our dull history for sleep, we aim to present these sometimes startling facts in a composed, steady way, letting the truth's inherent weight be the primary focus. For now, let the conventional, often dismissive understanding of conspiracy theories rest quietly as we unearth the documented facts that shifted the sands, revealing secrets once hidden from plain sight. Welcome back to our quiet exploration of history's surprising truths. Tonight we delve into a narrative that, for many years, was a staple of what some might call conspiracy folklore. The unsettling idea that the United States Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, secretly manipulated the mainstream media. It's a claim that drew swift dismissal, painted as a paranoid fantasy. Yet as we shall see, the line between a widely ridiculed theory and a documented government program can sometimes be unnervingly thin. Our focus is the story of how these whispers grew into confirmed revelations, forever altering perceptions of both the press and the intelligence community. To understand the origins of such a program, we must transport ourselves back to the height of the Cold War. This was an era defined by intense ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, a battle fought not only with weapons and espionage, but also with information and propaganda. Governments on both sides were deeply invested in shaping public opinion, both at home and abroad. In this atmosphere of pervasive suspicion and high-stakes geopolitical maneuvering, the concept of national security often justified actions that would, in other times, be deemed unthinkable or profoundly undemocratic by many citizens. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, murmurs began to surface. These were not initially front-page headlines, but rather persistent undercurrents of concern, often voiced by those on the political fringes or among investigative journalists probing the nascent intelligence apparatus. The accusations were varied, but shared a common theme, that the CIA was not merely a passive consumer of news, but an active, albeit covert participant in its creation and dissemination. Some suggested that respected journalists were knowingly or unknowingly on the agency's payroll, or were subtly guided to report stories in a particular light to favor U.S. foreign policy objectives. For the most part, these early allegations were met with staunch denial and widespread ridicule. The established media outlets, often the very subjects of these suspicions, were quick to dismiss such claims as baseless attacks on their integrity. Government officials, when they addressed the issue at all, typically characterized the accusers as misinformed, malicious, or naive. The notion that a U.S. intelligence agency would systematically infiltrate and influence its own nation's press seemed, to many, to be an affront to democratic principles and the constitutionally protected ideal of a free press. It was, for a long time, comfortably filed under unthinkable. The cherished ideal of a free and independent press, a cornerstone of American democracy, played a significant role in this initial disbelief. The press was envisioned as a watchdog, a fourth estate holding power accountable, not a tool to be wielded by it. For many Americans, the idea that esteemed news organizations and familiar journalistic bylines could be secretly compromised by an intelligence agency was not just shocking, but deeply antithetical to the nation's core values. This strong cultural belief made it difficult for the early, scattered accusations to gain significant traction or widespread public acceptance for many years. However, the socio-political landscape of the United States began to shift in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The protracted and divisive Vietnam War, coupled with the constitutional crisis of Watergate, eroded public trust in government institutions to an unprecedented degree. Official statements were increasingly met with skepticism, and a growing segment of the population became more receptive to the idea that powerful entities might indeed be capable of deception and overreach. This era of disillusionment created a more fertile ground for investigations into long-held suspicions about government secrecy and misconduct. It was within this atmosphere of questioning that the whispers about CIA media manipulation began to gain a more serious, if still cautious, hearing. Investigative reporters, spurred by the changing public mood and emboldened by successes in uncovering other governmental deceptions, started to dig deeper. Articles began to appear in less mainstream publications, citing former intelligence officers or anonymous sources, hinting at the scope of the CIA's efforts to influence narratives. While concrete proof remained elusive for a time, the sheer persistence of these claims, coupled with other contemporaneous revelations of intelligence abuses, started to paint a troubling picture. The dam of denial truly began to break in the mid-1970s with the formation of the United States Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, more commonly known as the Church Committee, named after its chairman, Senator Frank Church. Established in 1975, this committee was tasked with a sweeping investigation into abuses by the CIA, NSA, and FBI, following a series of damaging press revelations about illegal domestic spying, assassination plots, and other covert activities that seem to have spiraled far beyond any reasonable mandate or oversight. While the Church Committee's overall brief was broad, a significant and sensitive part of its investigation focused squarely on the relationship between U.S. intelligence agencies and the American media. The senators and their staff sought to determine the extent to which the CIA had utilized journalists, both American and foreign, for intelligence purposes. They probed whether the agency had secretly funded or created media outlets, whether it had covertly placed propaganda in news reporting, and whether it had indeed managed to enlist working journalists, wittingly or unwittingly, into its clandestine operations in ways that compromised journalistic ethics and independence. The findings of the Church Committee, detailed in its final report published in 1976, were startling, even to a public already somewhat jaded by official misconduct. The committee confirmed that the CIA had indeed maintained a wide range of clandestine relationships with hundreds of American journalists and numerous U.S. media organizations for decades. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a systematic, albeit often compartmented, effort to use the press for intelligence gathering, cover, and as a conduit for propaganda. The official confirmation sent ripples through both Washington, D.C. and newsrooms across the country. The nature of these relationships varied considerably. The Church Committee found that some journalists were direct paid employees or contract agents of the CIA, actively undertaking intelligence tasks under the guise of their journalistic work. Others were what the agency termed unwitting assets, providing information or assistance without being fully aware of their interlocutor's CIA affiliation or the ultimate use of their contributions. The CIA also admitted to providing classified information to certain journalists to shape stories and to owning or funding various news organizations, particularly overseas, to disseminate its preferred narratives. The term Operation Mockingbird became the popular, almost notorious, shorthand for these extensive CIA media operations, although the Church Committee itself did not use this specific codename extensively in its public report. Reports and subsequent research indicated that the program, in its various iterations, involved dozens, perhaps hundreds, of American journalists, stringers, and employees of prominent news outlets, including some of the most respected names in American journalism. The CIA reportedly had arrangements with news services, influential columnists, and broadcasters, allowing it to study and sometimes influence the information flow. While the precise origins and full scope of Operation Mockingbird remain somewhat shrouded due to the inherent secrecy of such programs, investigations revealed it began in the early years of the Cold War, likely in the late 1950s. Its primary aim was to influence foreign public opinion and counter Soviet propaganda, but the lines often blurred, especially when foreign-facing stories found their way back to American audiences. The program allegedly involved everything from planting specific stories in newspapers to secretly subsidizing books and cultural magazines that promoted a pro-American viewpoint or discredited opposing ideologies. The Church Committee report, though sometimes redacting specific names of individuals and media outlets to protect ongoing intelligence sources or avoid undue damage, provided enough detail to paint a clear picture. It cited instances where the CIA had journalists on its payroll who would write articles on demand or who would allow their journalistic credentials to be used by CIA officers. It also documented cases where the agency reviewed and sometimes altered news reports before they were published or broadcast through its assets. These revelations confirmed that a significant level of covert influence was indeed possible and had occurred. In the wake of the Church Committee's explosive findings and the ensuing public and congressional outcry, the CIA's director, George H.W. Bush, issued directives in 1976. These were aimed at curtailing some of the most criticized practices. The guidelines purportedly prohibited paid or contractual relationships with journalists accredited by any U.S. news service, newspaper, periodical, radio, or television network. However, critics pointed out potential loopholes and ambiguities, particularly concerning unpaid cooperation, dealings with foreign journalists, or non-accredited stringers, leaving room for continued concern. The confirmation of Operation Mockingbird and similar activities dealt a severe blow to public trust in both the government and the mainstream media, a trust already weakened by Vietnam and Watergate. It validated long-held suspicions for some and created new anxieties for others about the true independence of the press. The legacy of these revelations is a persistent skepticism towards official narratives and media reporting, a sense that powerful hidden hands might still be shaping the news we consume. It underscored the inherent tension between the needs of national security and the principles of a free, transparent society. Tonight, our journey into history's shadows takes us to perhaps one of the most disturbing and, for many years, widely disbelieved chapters of clandestine government activity. The CIA's infamous program, its official name Project MKUltra. The very name has become synonymous with sinister experimentation and the darkest fears of state overreach. For decades, shocking tales of secret mind control efforts involving psychedelic drugs and psychological torture inflicted on unsuspecting citizens were largely dismissed as the product of overactive imaginations or outright paranoia. Yet, this crazy theory, as we will uncover, held a terrifying core of undeniable documented truth. The genesis of MKUltra, like so many covert operations of its time, is rooted firmly in the icy grip of the Cold War. Launched in the early 1950s, the program was fueled by a palpable fear within American intelligence circles that adversaries like the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea were developing or even deploying sophisticated mind control techniques. There were alarming, often unverified reports of brainwashing successfully used on prisoners of war. In the desperate race for an ideological and strategic edge, the CIA felt urgent pressure to surpass any enemy capabilities in this shadowy psychological warfare. The claims surrounding MKUltra were indeed extraordinary, sounding like lurid plot elements from a dystopian science fiction thriller. Whispers, and later more direct accusations, spoke of secret human experiments. These involved the administration of powerful psychoactive drugs, most notably LSD, to unwitting subjects. There were tales of prolonged sensory deprivation, intensive hypnosis, electroshock therapy applied for non-therapeutic purposes, covert radiation, verbal and sexual abuse, and various forms of extreme psychological torture. The alleged goal: to develop insidious methods for controlling human thought and behavior, to create reliable truth serums, to induce lasting amnesia, or even, some feared, to program individuals to become unwitting assassins or couriers. For over 2 decades, the official response from the CIA and the U.S. government to such allegations was unequivocal, complete and utter denial. These were not activities, they insisted, that a democratic nation engaged in. The stories were branded as malicious fabrications, slanderous attacks designed to discredit the agency and undermine national security during a critical Cold War period. Mainstream press, for the most part, either ignored the claims or reported the official denials with little independent challenge. The sheer audacity of the alleged experiments made them seem inherently implausible. Those who attempted to bring these harrowing theories to light faced an almost insurmountable challenge. They were up against the formidable wall of government secrecy, an institution adept at classifying information and discrediting its critics. Concrete proof was virtually impossible to obtain for decades. Survivors of what they claimed were non-consensual experiments often had fragmented, painful memories or were themselves deemed unreliable witnesses, sometimes due to the very psychological trauma they had endured with devastating consequences. The outlandish nature of their claims led to them being dismissed or marginalized. As the 1960s bled into the early 1970s, the American public's perception of its government underwent a profound transformation. The credibility gap fueled by the Vietnam War, followed by the shocking revelations of the Watergate scandal, shattered much of the post-World War II faith in official pronouncements for many people. A new era of skepticism dawned, and journalists became more aggressive in their pursuit of governmental wrongdoing. It was in this changed atmosphere that previously dismissed conspiracy theories, including those about CIA abuses, began to seem less like fiction and more like disturbing possibilities worth investigating. The first significant cracks in the wall of official denial began to appear through the work of determined investigative journalists and the courageous, albeit rare, accounts from individuals who had some knowledge of these highly secret programs. While not yet providing a complete picture, these early reports, often published in smaller independent media outlets, started to suggest that the U.S. government had indeed engaged in deeply unethical human experimentation. These initial exposés laid crucial groundwork for the more extensive inquiries that were to follow, raising uncomfortable questions. The primary catalysts for uncovering the truth about MKUltra were a series of official investigations launched in the mid-1970s. Alongside the previously mentioned Church Committee in the Senate, President Gerald Ford established the Rockefeller Commission in 1975 to investigate CIA activities within the United States. These bodies were created in response to mounting public pressure and truly explosive newspaper reports, detailing a wide-ranging list of illegal and unauthorized intelligence operations, painting a picture of an agency operating without sufficient oversight. These investigative committees were specifically tasked with examining any evidence of domestic intelligence abuses, which naturally included the persistent and deeply troubling allegations of non-consensual human experimentation, often incomplete or heavily redacted. Senators, congressmen, and their staff began the arduous process of poring over records, seeking internal government documents, and subpoenaing current and former CIA officials for testimony. The initial search was challenging. The CIA was an agency built on secrecy, and many involved were deeply reluctant to divulge information. A pivotal breakthrough occurred in 1977, 2 years after the Church Committee had published its initial findings on other matters. Following a Freedom of Information Act request, a cache of approximately 20,000 pages of previously undisclosed MKUltra documents was discovered, though incomplete. These records had mistakenly survived a 1973 order by then CIA Director Richard Helms to destroy all files related to the program. While many documents were indeed lost forever, this surviving trove of records, research proposals, and progress reports provided the first undeniable official proof of the program's existence. The declassified documents and testimony gathered by investigators painted a chilling picture. MKUltra, which ran officially from 1953 to 1973, was a far-reaching and highly compartmented program involving at least 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies, often unwittingly involved. The CIA funneled millions of dollars, often through front organizations, to fund research into methods of influencing and controlling the human mind. The program encompassed 149 sub-projects, exploring everything from hypnosis and sensory deprivation to the effects of psychoactive drugs. The experiments conducted under the MKUltra umbrella were diverse and deeply disturbing, often repeated over extended periods. Researchers administered high doses of LSD and other hallucinogens to subjects, often without their knowledge or informed consent, to study their effects on behavior and cognition. Other techniques included prolonged sensory deprivation, electroconvulsive therapy applied at dangerously high levels, hypnosis, and the use of paralytics and other drugs in conjunction with psychological manipulation. The records detailed a disregard for the well-being of the individuals subjected to these often harrowing procedures. Tragically, many of the subjects of MKUltra experiments were individuals from vulnerable populations who were unable to give meaningful consent or were in no position to refuse, and even children in some reports. These included prisoners, psychiatric patients, and, in some documented instances, members of the general public who were surreptitiously dosed with drugs in settings like brothels, Operation Midnight Climax, or other public places. The ethical and moral breaches were profound, representing a stark betrayal of trust and a violation of fundamental human rights by a government agency. The officially stated goals of MKUltra were to develop tools for interrogating suspected spies, to understand and replicate alleged Soviet mind control techniques, and to find ways to manipulate foreign leaders or other targets, including breaking down existing personalities. However, the breadth of the experimentation suggests a wider agenda, including the potential to incapacitate individuals, induce amnesia, implant false memories, or even to explore the feasibility of creating programmed couriers or assassins. The full extent of these more extreme ambitions remains obscured due to the destruction of project files. The deliberate destruction of most MKUltra records in 1973 by order of CIA Director Richard Helms, just as congressional investigations into intelligence activities were beginning to gain momentum, was a blow to achieving full accountability and comprehensive understanding. This act, done to protect the identities of researchers and institutions involved, also ensured that a complete understanding of the program's scope, its most egregious abuses, and the full list of its many victims would likely never be known. It left a permanent shadow, though surviving documents provided enough evidence. The revelations about MKUltra sparked public outrage and led to Senate hearings in 1977, while some former CIA officials testified and President Ford issued a formal apology for the abuses. Direct accountability for those who designed and executed the program was limited. Some victims and their families did pursue lawsuits, leading to small settlements in a few cases, but many suffered the long-term psychological and physical consequences of the experiments in silence. Their experiences validated far too late. Many others were simply lost to history. Our quiet journey through history now leads us to a chapter of profound medical betrayal, its name now synonymous with infamy, the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. Officially initiated in 1932 by the United States Public Health Service, what was presented as a study offering medical care was, in reality, a deeply unethical, decades-long experiment. For 40 years, vulnerable men were deceived and denied effective treatment for a debilitating disease, all in the name of so-called observation. To comprehend how such a study could be conceived, we must consider its era. The year was 1932, a time of entrenched racial segregation and discrimination in the American South. African Americans in rural areas like Macon County, Alabama, faced systemic poverty and had extremely limited healthcare access, often relying on folk remedies. Prevailing attitudes within parts of the medical community also reflected societal racial biases, deeming black individuals as different or less deserving of ethical consideration. The stated aim of the Tuskegee study was to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in black men. Researchers wanted to understand the disease's full course. However, this objective was, from the outset, built upon profound ethical compromise. The study recruited 600 African American men, 399 with syphilis, and a control group of 201 without. The horrifying truth: the men with syphilis would not receive known effective treatment, their suffering deemed secondary to data. The cornerstone of the Tuskegee study was blatant deception. The participants were never informed of their actual diagnosis, syphilis, nor the study's true purpose, tracking the disease until autopsy. Instead, they were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term for various ailments. This deliberate misrepresentation, repeated for decades, was crucial for ensuring their continued participation, as they trusted the government doctors, who they believed were genuinely helping them. To secure their cooperation over decades, the men were offered incentives. These included free medical exams, free rides to clinics, hot meals on exam days, and burial insurance. For impoverished sharecroppers in the Depression-era South, these offerings were substantial. The burial insurance was a powerful lure, exploiting their poverty and desire not to burden families, while ensuring researchers could obtain autopsies, a final grim data point for their records. The study, projected for 6 months, extended indefinitely as researchers saw an opportunity to follow these men until death. Throughout the 1930s and early 1940s, the men underwent periodic exams, including painful spinal taps, misleadingly called special treatments. All the while, their syphilis progressed, leading to severe complications: blindness, deafness, mental deterioration, heart disease, and bone damage, all preventable outcomes had they been treated. A critical ethical turning point arrived in the mid-1940s. By 1947, penicillin was widely recognized as a safe, effective cure for syphilis. Standard medical practice shifted to treating syphilis patients with this new miracle drug. This development presented the U.S. Public Health Service researchers with an undeniable moral imperative: halt their observational study and provide the men in Tuskegee with this life-saving treatment, which could readily cure their debilitating illness. Tragically, the U.S. Public Health Service deliberately decided not to treat the men in the Tuskegee study with penicillin. They also chose not to inform them that a cure for their bad blood was available. Researchers argued that treating the men would end their unique opportunity to study untreated syphilis until death and autopsy. This decision, a profound moral failure, sealed the fate of many, condemning them to years of suffering, disability, and premature death, all for scientific data. The study's organizers went to extraordinary lengths to ensure their subjects remained untreated by any other medical providers. They actively worked to prevent the men from receiving syphilis treatment from other sources. During World War II, when many were drafted, study officials intervened to exempt them from the military standard practice of treating syphilis. They also provided lists of participants to local doctors, requesting these men not be treated for syphilis by them. For decades, the Tuskegee study continued in secrecy, shielded from public scrutiny. While not a conspiracy theory in the popular sense, it was a conspiracy of silence and ethical blindness within government and medical circles. Over the years, some public health service officials and doctors involved did express private misgivings about the study's continuation, especially after penicillin. However, these concerns were consistently overruled by those in charge of this deeply flawed research project. The long silence was finally broken thanks to the conscience of Peter Buxton, a venereal disease investigator with the Public Health Service. In 1966, he learned of the Tuskegee study and was immediately horrified by its unethical nature. He believed it was a clear violation of rights and medical ethics. For several years, Buxton raised his concerns through official PHS channels, arguing passionately that the study was immoral and the men should be treated. His pleas for intervention, however, were ignored. Despite his efforts, Peter Buxton's internal protests were dismissed by superiors and PHS officials who defended the study's value. Frustrated and deeply troubled by the ongoing injustice, and believing he had exhausted all internal avenues for recourse, Buxton made the courageous decision to leak information about the study to the press. He recognized that public exposure was likely the only way to force an end to this horrifying, decades-long medical experiment, a truly brave act. In July of 1972, the story finally broke. Gene Heller, an investigative reporter with the Associated Press, published a front-page article based on Peter Buxton's information. The details were shocking. A U.S. government agency conducted a 40-year study where poor African-American men with syphilis were deliberately left untreated even after a cure was available. The news sent waves of disbelief and outrage across the nation and the world. The secret of Tuskegee was exposed in its appalling detail. The public outcry following Jean Heller's exposé was immediate and intense. There was no denying the core facts, rooted in official documents. Within days, the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HHW, launched an ad hoc advisory panel to investigate. Senate hearings, led by Senator Edward Kennedy, were convened shortly thereafter, bringing the unethical conduct of public health service officials and cooperating doctors under the full glare of national scrutiny, demanding answers and accountability for this grave injustice. The confirmation of Tuskegee's horrific details ignited widespread moral indignation. It became a symbol of medical racism and governmental betrayal. For the African-American community, the revelations were devastating, profoundly damaging trust in the public health system and medical research, a mistrust that persists. The study underscored how vulnerable populations could be exploited under the guise of science, and how racial bias could lead to a complete abandonment of ethical principles by trusted professionals. Under immense pressure, the Tuskegee study was terminated on November 16, 1972. A class action lawsuit was filed, and in 1974 a $10 million zero-cent settlement was reached, providing lifetime medical benefits and burial services to surviving participants, infected wives, widows, and children. No sum could compensate for the suffering. This shameful episode led to the National Research Act of 1974, mandating institutional review boards and informed consent, crucial ethical reforms born from tragedy. Welcome once again to our quiet corner of history, where tonight we unravel a complex web of covert operations that shook a popular American presidency to its core, the Iran-Contra affair. During the mid-1980s, whispers began to circulate of a secret, illegal, and almost unbelievable scheme orchestrated from within the White House itself. These were claims of trading arms with an avowed enemy, Iran, in exchange for hostages, and then diverting the profits to fund a proxy war in Central America. For many, it sounded like pure political fiction, a conspiracy theory too audacious to be true, yet as events would prove, it was all too real. To understand the Iran-Contra affair, we must first recall the geopolitical landscape of the 30s, 100s, and 80s. The United States had a stated policy of not negotiating with terrorists and maintained a strict arms embargo against Iran, a nation considered a state sponsor of terrorism following the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Simultaneously, in Nicaragua, the Reagan administration was deeply committed to supporting the right-wing Contra rebels fighting the socialist Sandinista government. However, Congress, through a series of measures known as the Boland Amendment, had explicitly prohibited U.S. government funding for the Contras, creating a significant foreign policy dilemma for the White House. The initial theories or rumors began as fragmented pieces of information in the mid-1980s. There were suggestions that the U.S. was secretly selling weapons, including sophisticated anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, to Iran. This was shocking enough given the public animosity between the two nations and the official arms embargo. More disturbingly, these alleged arms sales were increasingly linked to efforts to secure the release of American hostages being held in Lebanon by Hezbollah, a militant group with strong operational and financial ties to Iran. The implication was a direct trade, arms for hostages. When these whispers first surfaced in scattered media reports, the Reagan administration issued firm and unequivocal denials. Officials insisted that the U.S. was not selling arms to Iran and would never trade weapons for hostages, as this would only encourage more hostage-taking. Given President Reagan's immense popularity and his strong public stance against terrorism, many Americans were inclined to believe these denials. The idea that his administration would engage in such a convoluted and hypocritical scheme seemed far-fetched to the general public and many in the political establishment at that particular time. The other, equally explosive part of the emerging conspiracy theory concerned the Nicaraguan Contras. Rumors suggested that the profits generated from these secret arms sales to Iran were not going into the U.S. Treasury, but were instead being illegally diverted to fund the Contras. This would represent a deliberate effort to circumvent the Boland Amendment and deceive Congress. If true, it meant that a shadow foreign policy was being conducted by a small group within the administration, operating outside the law and without the knowledge or consent of the American people or their elected representatives, a deeply troubling prospect. The carefully constructed wall of denial began to crumble spectacularly in November 1986. A small Lebanese magazine, Ashura, published an article exposing secret U.S. arms sales to Iran. The report claimed that senior American officials, including National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane, had secretly traveled to Tehran to negotiate these deals. This was not an anonymous blog post, but a specific claim appearing in print, quickly picked up by international news agencies. The obscure magazine article lit the fuse that would ignite a massive political scandal that would dominate headlines for years. Once the Ashura story broke internationally, the American media began to investigate with renewed intensity. Major newspapers and television networks started to corroborate aspects of the report, citing their own sources within the government and intelligence communities. The administration initially tried to downplay the significance of the contacts with Iran, characterizing them as diplomatic overtures to moderate elements within the Iranian regime, rather than arms deals. However, the sheer volume of emerging details made this explanation increasingly untenable as the days and weeks passed and public skepticism grew. Faced with mounting evidence and intense media scrutiny, President Reagan addressed the nation. In his initial statements, he admitted that the U.S. had made overtures to Iran and that a small amount of defensive weaponry had been shipped. However, he vehemently denied that these shipments constituted an arms-for-hostages deal, insisting they were intended to build relations with perceived Iranian moderates. As the scandal deepened, the president's recollection of key events would become a significant issue, with later inquiries revealing a pattern of him stating he could not recall specific details or crucial decisions. Most significant official confirmation of the affair's illegal dimensions came later in November 1986 from Attorney General Edwin Meese III. After conducting a hurried internal inquiry, Meese held a dramatic press conference. He announced that his investigation had found that proceeds from the arms sales to Iran had indeed been diverted to support the Nicaraguan Contras. This was the smoking gun that connected the two seemingly disparate parts of the rumored scheme. Meese's revelation indicated that at least some officials had engaged in potentially criminal activity and a widespread cover-up. Edwin Meese's stunning admission triggered a cascade of official investigations. President Reagan appointed former Senator John Tower to lead a special review board, known as the Tower Commission, to examine the role of the National Security Council staff in the affair. Simultaneously, Congress announced it would form joint House-Senate Select Committees to conduct its own comprehensive investigation, with televised public hearings. Crucially, an independent counsel, Lawrence E. Walsh, was appointed to investigate potential criminal wrongdoing by government officials involved in this complex and rapidly expanding scandal. As these investigations progressed, a cast of key figures emerged from the shadows. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a charismatic Marine officer on the National Security Council staff, was identified as a central operative who managed the logistical details of both the arms sales and the Contra supply network. His superior, National Security Advisor John Poindexter, was also heavily implicated, as was a previous National Security Advisor, Robert McFarlane. CIA Director William Casey was another prominent figure whose name was linked to the clandestine operations, though his death in 1987 precluded his full testimony. The investigations, particularly the Tower Commission report and the congressional hearings, painstakingly pieced together the mechanics of the arms for hostages deals. It was revealed that the U.S., sometimes using Israel as an intermediary, had secretly shipped hundreds of TOW anti-tank missiles and Hawk anti-aircraft missile parts to Iran. These sales were directly linked to the release of 3 American hostages in Lebanon. Despite official denials, the evidence overwhelmingly showed a quid pro quo. American weapons in exchange for American lives, a policy the administration had publicly and repeatedly disavowed. The equally damning aspect was the diversion of funds. Profits from the Iranian arms sales, which were often sold at inflated prices, were channeled through a labyrinthine network of Swiss bank accounts and shell corporations controlled by Oliver North and his associates, a system referred to as the Enterprise. This money, estimated to be in the millions of dollars, was then used to purchase weapons, supplies, and equipment for the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, all in direct contravention of the Boland Amendment's restrictions and without any congressional authorization or proper oversight. The Iran-Contra affair exposed a troubling reality. A small group within the National Security Council staff had effectively created and run a covert foreign policy apparatus from within the White House. This shadow operation bypassed established governmental channels, including the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the CIA's normal oversight mechanisms. Decisions were made in secret, often without proper authorization, and then actively concealed from Congress and the American public, raising profound questions about accountability and the rule of law in a democratic system of government. The televised congressional hearings in the summer of 1987 captivated the nation. Oliver North, in particular, became a controversial figure, defiantly defending his actions as those of a patriot. The hearings revealed a widespread pattern of deception, document shredding, false statements, and obstruction of justice by administration officials attempting to conceal their activities. While President Reagan was not directly implicated in ordering the illegal diversion of funds, the investigations painted a picture of a disengaged president whose subordinates felt empowered to act outside the law in his name, believing they were fulfilling his wishes. The independent counsel's investigation, led by Lawrence Walsh, spanned several years and resulted in indictments against 14 individuals, including John Poindexter, Oliver North, and former Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger. Several were convicted, though some convictions, notably North's and Poindexter's, were later overturned on appeal due to issues related to immunized congressional testimony. In a final controversial act, President George H.W. Bush, who had been vice president during the affair, issued pardons to 6 individuals in December 1992, effectively ending further prosecutions related to the scandal. Tonight, our quiet exploration into the often unsettling corners of history brings us to a Cold War program so macabre, its seemingly benign public codename so at odds with its mission that for many years the very idea of it was dismissed as a ghoulish conspiracy theory. We are talking about Project Sunshine, a U.S. government initiative involving the secret collection of human tissue, including from deceased infants and children. The chilling purpose? To study the escalating effects of radioactive fallout from nuclear weapons testing. This is the story of how those disturbing whispers were eventually confirmed as undeniable documented fact. To understand the impetus behind such a program, we must return to the dawn of the nuclear age in the late 1940s and 1950s. The United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in a frantic arms race, conducting numerous atmospheric tests of atomic and hydrogen bombs, posing an unprecedented and poorly understood global health threat. With each explosion, vast quantities of radioactive particles were blasted into the atmosphere, eventually falling back to Earth as fallout. Public anxiety grew particularly concerning elements like strontium-90, a radioactive isotope that could be absorbed into bones and pose a long-term health risk. Scientists and government officials faced an urgent critical question: just how much of this radioactive fallout, particularly strontium-90, was entering the human body, contaminating the food chain, and what were its potential biological effects, especially in their rapidly forming bones and developing tissues. Strontium-90 mimics calcium, meaning it could be readily incorporated into developing bones and teeth, particularly in infants and young children who are rapidly growing and consuming milk, a primary pathway for the isotope. To accurately measure this internal contamination and assess the true global risk, direct analysis of human tissue was deemed essential by researchers. The theory, or rather the deeply unsettling suspicion that began to circulate, was that the U.S. government, through agencies like the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, was going to extreme and ethically questionable lengths to obtain these necessary human samples, a truly ghoulish prospect that haunted the fringes of public awareness. Whispers suggested that researchers were systematically collecting tissue from the recently deceased, including stillborn babies and young children from around the world, often without the full, informed consent of grieving families. The idea was that these samples of opportunity were being harvested on a global scale. For a considerable time, such claims were met with a mixture of public skepticism and official silence or vague non-committal statements, justifying this grim harvest as vital for national and global security. The notion of government agents or their proxies snatching bodies or parts of bodies, particularly those of infants, for secret scientific research seemed too horrific, too much like a plot from a Gothic horror story to be true. It was an accusation that many found difficult to believe could occur in democratic societies. The clandestine nature of the actual collection efforts helped maintain this veil of public disbelief for years. The scientific rationale, however grim, was straightforward to those conducting the research. To accurately assess the global distribution and concentration of strontium-90 in human populations, a wide range of samples was needed. Young children and infants were of particular interest because their rapidly developing bones would show the most recent and direct uptake of strontium-90 from the environment. This utilitarian argument, however, deliberately sidestepped fundamental bioethical principles and the rights of individuals and their families over their own bodies and those of their deceased loved ones. Project Sunshine officially began in 1953 under the auspices of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission with assistance from organizations like the U.S. Air Force. It was part of a larger effort, including projects codenamed Gabrielle, to understand the impact of radioactive isotopes. This global network operated largely in the shadows, beyond easy scrutiny. The program's objective was to collect thousands of human bone samples and sometimes other tissues from deceased individuals across the globe. This was a highly organized clandestine international operation to gather the raw materials for their fallout research. The methods used for collecting these human remains were deeply problematic and, by today's standards, profoundly unethical, effectively treating grieving families and their deceased loved ones as mere data points. In many instances, tissue samples, particularly bones like femurs or ribs, were taken from the bodies of the recently deceased, including stillborns and infants, without the explicit informed consent of their parents or next of kin. Sometimes, consent forms were vague or families were misled. In other cases, no consent was sought at all, with pathologists quietly providing samples. To achieve its global sampling goals, Project Sunshine and related initiatives established a network of suppliers. Pathologists, doctors, hospitals, and morgues in numerous countries across Europe, Australia, South America, and other regions were enlisted, sometimes unwittingly, to provide these human specimens. This macabre supply chain funneled samples into the U.S. research apparatus. They would collect bone samples during autopsies or from anatomical donations and ship them to U.S. laboratories for analysis. Many international collaborators were likely unaware of the full U.S. government program. While widespread public knowledge of Project Sunshine was decades away, there were occasional internal discussions and some degree of disquiet among scientists and officials involved regarding the ethical implications. The urgency of the Cold War often provided a convenient shield for such questionable methods. However, the sheer scale and the morally ambiguous nature of acquiring human tissue without clear consent laid the groundwork for future condemnation once the details eventually surfaced into the public domain, revealing the extent of the government's actions. The full truth about Project Sunshine and its associated body-snatching activities did not emerge suddenly, but rather through a slow process of declassification of government documents, diligent investigative journalism, and academic research, primarily from the 1970s through the early 2000s. These historical detectives painstakingly unearthed the uncomfortable truth from official obscurity. As Cold War secrecy began to thaw and public records laws became more effective, researchers and reporters started piecing together the disturbing puzzle from fragmented official reports and internal memos. Several key U.S. Atomic Energy Commission documents, once declassified, provided undeniable proof confirming the systematic collection of human remains on a startling international scale. Reports from the 1950s openly discussed the need for human samples, particularly from infants, and detailed strategies for their worldwide collection. One infamous 1955 AEC memo starkly stated, "If nobody worried about kids dying of fallout, then what was the government spending all this money for? Human samples are of prime importance, and if anybody knows how to do a good job of body snatching, they will really be serving their country." The declassified information revealed the astonishing scale of Project Sunshine. It's estimated that tissues from thousands of individuals, perhaps as many as 1,500 in one particular study focusing on infants, were collected and analyzed from around the globe. This vast, silent harvest of the dead represented a chilling aspect of Cold War science. Samples came from dozens of countries, often with an emphasis on areas with known dietary patterns. The primary focus was on bone to measure strontium-90, but other organs were sometimes collected. The codenames themselves, Project Sunshine and Project Gabrielle, which studied the lethal effects of strontium-90 if warfare made areas uninhabitable, had an almost benign or even hopeful sound, a stark dichotomy between public image and the unsettling, classified activities. Sunshine was reportedly chosen because strontium-90 fell from the sky, much like sunshine. These innocuous labels stood in stark contrast to the grim reality of the research, the harvesting of human remains, often from the most vulnerable, without truly informed consent, to understand the poisons of the nuclear age. When the full extent of these government-sanctioned body-snatching programs became more widely known, particularly through investigative reports in the 1990s, it provoked significant public outrage and intense ethical debate. The sense of betrayal was profound, particularly for those who unknowingly contributed. Families who suspected their deceased loved ones, especially infants, might have been part of these studies were horrified. Ethicists and human rights advocates condemned the programs as a profound violation of human dignity and trust, highlighting the dangers of unchecked government secrecy. The revelations surrounding Project Sunshine and similar clandestine research contributed to a growing movement for greater transparency and stricter ethical oversight in government-sponsored scientific studies. It stands as a somber reminder of the need for constant vigilance in protecting human rights in research. While regulations were already evolving, the exposure of such past abuses reinforced the critical importance of informed consent, the rights of individuals and families over their bodies and remains, and the need for independent review boards to scrutinize research protocols. It served as a sobering lesson. Tonight, we venture into one of the most chilling declassified secrets of the Cold War, a plan so audacious and morally disturbing that, had it been merely a theory at the time, it would have been dismissed as unthinkable anti-government paranoia. We are examining Operation Northwoods, a formal proposal drafted in 1962 by the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff. This was not a fringe idea, but a top-level military plan to stage fake terrorist attacks against American citizens and targets and then blame Cuba to create a pretext for war. It is a stark reminder of how far some were willing to go. A chillingly cynical document. To understand the genesis of Operation Northwoods, we must immerse ourselves in the intense Cold War climate of the early 1960 SUS. Fidel Castro's communist revolution in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, was a major source of alarm and frustration for Washington. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 had embarrassed the U.S. and emboldened Castro. There was an almost obsessive desire within powerful factions of the U.S. military and intelligence communities to remove Castro from power and neutralize what they saw as a dangerous Soviet foothold in the Western Hemisphere. This proximity fueled a sense of urgency. The core of Operation Northwoods, as detailed in the declassified documents, was the deliberate creation of pretexts, false flag operations, that would provide justification for a full-scale U.S. military invasion of Cuba. The Joint Chiefs of Staff proposed that the United States government itself would covertly engineer a series of incidents that could be convincingly blamed on Fidel Castro's government. The aim was to manipulate public opinion both domestically and internationally, creating an overwhelming demand for intervention against a seemingly aggressive and dangerous Cuban regime. The goal was to enrage the American nation. The specific attacks proposed within the Operation Northwoods memorandum were deeply shocking in their cynicism. Suggestions included sinking a U.S. warship in Guantanamo Bay and blaming Cuba, reminiscent of the USA Maine incident that sparked the Spanish-American War. They also contemplated staging attacks on U.S. military bases, developing a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, and even orchestrating the shoot-down of a civilian airliner, which would be made to appear as an unprovoked Cuban attack. Another idea was to fake the destruction of a drone aircraft. Casualties among servicemen could be engineered. The explicitly stated goal of these horrifying self-inflicted Cuban aggressions was to create an irrefutable case for U.S. military intervention. The Joint Chiefs of Staff believed that such incidents, if convincingly staged and expertly managed through propaganda, would galvanize American public support for an invasion of Cuba. Furthermore, they hoped it would sway international opinion, providing a defensible casus belli on the world stage. The plan was designed to overcome any political reluctance by manufacturing an undeniable provocation, causing national indignation. It is crucial to emphasize who authored this proposal. Operation Northwoods was not the product of a rogue intelligence cell or a fringe extremist group. It was formally submitted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking uniformed military leaders of the U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps. The plan was signed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Lyman L. Lemitzer, and had the approval of all the Joint Chiefs. This fact underscores the alarming extent to which such extreme measures were being seriously contemplated at the very top of the U.S. military hierarchy. Strategic recommendations indeed. The details of Operation Northwoods are contained in a formerly top-secret memorandum dated March 13, 1962, titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. The language within the document is stark and utilitarian, discussing the creation of incidents and pretexts with a chilling detachment. For instance, one section read, "We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The terror campaign could be pointed at Cuban refugees seeking haven. This was a detailed blueprint for deception, using Cuban aircraft for actions." Underpinning the entire Operation Northwoods proposal was a bold and deeply cynical assumption that the American public, the U.S. Congress, and the international community could be successfully deceived. The plan relied on the ability of the U.S. military and intelligence agencies to stage these complex events, manage the subsequent narratives through media manipulation and propaganda, and ensure that the truth that the U.S. itself was the perpetrator would never be discovered. It assumed that U.S. involvement could be concealed. Operation Northwoods did not exist in a vacuum. It was part of a much broader and aggressive U.S. government effort to destabilize and overthrow Fidel Castro's regime, collectively known as Operation Mongoose, also called the Cuban Project. This larger covert operation run by the CIA and sanctioned at high levels, involved economic warfare, propaganda, and paramilitary actions. The Northwoods proposal represented the military's desire for a more direct and decisive approach, illustrating the extreme anti-Castro sentiment and interventionist mindset prevalent within parts of the U.S. government at that time. The Northwoods document was remarkably detailed in its suggestions for manufacturing these pretexts. Beyond the major proposals, it included ideas like faking attacks on Cuban refugees, staging riots near the main gate of the U.S. base at Guantanamo Bay, blowing up ammunition inside the base to simulate sabotage, and even conducting mock funerals for victims. The plan also suggested using MiG-like aircraft flown by U.S. pilots to harass civilian airliners or U.S. military planes, hoping to provoke a Cuban response. The breadth of deceptive scenarios is staggering. Critically, and thankfully for the course of history, Operation Northwoods was not approved or implemented. The proposal was submitted by General Lemnitzer to the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. Records indicate that McNamara and subsequently President John F. Kennedy rejected the plan. This rejection is a testament to the vital principle of civilian control over the military in the United States. While the military proposed these extreme measures, the civilian leadership ultimately had the authority to, and did, say no. This saved the U.S. from a disaster. The precise reasons for President Kennedy's and Secretary McNamara's rejection of Operation Northwoods are not explicitly detailed in a single declassified memo, but several factors likely played a role. The immense ethical and moral implications of a government attacking its own people or interests to fabricate a cause for war would have been staggering. Furthermore, the enormous risks of exposure which would have devastatingly damaged America's international standing and credibility were likely considered. The risk of global condemnation was also high. Following its rejection, the Operation Northwoods documents were classified as top secret and remained hidden from public view for nearly 4 decades. During these intervening years, any suggestion that the U.S. military leadership had formally proposed such deceptive and self-destructive acts would have been met with outright denial and likely dismissed as an outlandish and unsubstantiated conspiracy theory. The official secrecy surrounding the proposal effectively shielded this dark chapter of Cold War planning, a testament to dangerous thinking. Contemplating the what-if scenario, what if Operation Northwoods had been approved and implemented, is truly horrifying. The loss of innocent American lives, orchestrated by their own government, would have been an unthinkable betrayal. The subsequent invasion of Cuba, based on such a monumental deception, would have had profound and unpredictable geopolitical consequences, potentially escalating Cold War tensions to an even more dangerous level. The betrayal of ideals would have been catastrophic. The Operation Northwoods documents finally came to light in the late 1990s, primarily as a result of the work of the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Board, RAB. This independent agency, established by Congress in 1992, was tasked with declassifying government records related to President Kennedy's assassination. As part of this massive declassification effort, the Northwoods memo was unearthed and released to the public, first detailed by author James Bamford in his 2001 book, Body of Secrets. Its publication caused a sensation. The public and historical reaction to the declassification of Operation Northwoods was one of widespread shock and disbelief, even among seasoned Cold War historians. It confirmed that the highest echelons of the U.S. military had been willing to propose state-sponsored terrorism against their own country as a means to achieve foreign policy objectives. While it was crucial to remember the plan was rejected, the fact that it was seriously conceived and formally documented served as a chilling testament to the extreme paranoia and aggressive mindset that characterized certain powerful circles during that era. It underscores the importance of civilian oversight. Welcome back to our calm chronicle of truths more startling than fiction. Tonight we turn our gaze inward to a time when a powerful arm of the U.S. government, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, waged secret war against its own citizens. For years, activists in various movements spoke of harassment and disruption, claims often dismissed as exaggerated conspiracy theories. Yet these theories pointed to a chilling reality, a series of covert FBI programs collectively known as COINTELPRO, designed to undermine domestic political dissidents. This is the story of that profound betrayal of democratic ideal. To understand COINTELPRO, we must place it within the turbulent socio-political landscape of the mid-20th century United States, from the 1950s through the early 1970s. This era was marked by profound social upheaval, the burgeoning civil rights movement challenging entrenched segregation. From the perspective of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, these movements, while often seeking justice, were viewed with deep suspicion as threats to national security, sometimes linked to communist influence. Across these diverse movements, a common narrative of persecution began to emerge. Activists consistently reported experiencing intense surveillance, unexplained disruptions to their organizing efforts, and concerted campaigns to discredit their leaders and sow internal dissent. They spoke of anonymous threatening letters, false rumors being spread, agents provocateurs inciting violence, and inexplicable legal troubles. While these claims were deeply felt, proving they were part of a coordinated government effort rather than isolated incidents was exceedingly difficult for them. Complicating matters was the FBI's carefully cultivated public image under its long-serving director J. Edgar Hoover. For decades, Hoover had portrayed the FBI as an incorruptible, apolitical, and highly professional crime-fighting organization, dedicated solely to upholding the law and protecting America from genuine threats like organized crime and foreign espionage. This heroic public persona made it difficult for many ordinary Americans to believe that the same FBI could be systematically engaged in politically motivated sabotage and suppression of dissent. When allegations of FBI misconduct against political groups did surface, they were typically met with firm denials, official silence, or assertions that the Bureau was merely investigating illegal activities or individuals with subversive foreign ties. The inner workings of the FBI were shrouded in secrecy, and Hoover wielded immense political power, making any serious challenge to the Bureau's integrity a formidable task. For years, the true extent of the FBI's domestic counterintelligence programs remained hidden from public view, operating under layers of classification. The first major crack in this wall of secrecy occurred on March 8, 1971, in Media, Pennsylvania. A group of anti-war activists calling themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI broke into a small residential FBI field office. Their goal was audacious: to find concrete proof of the government's surveillance and disruption of dissident groups. They managed to steal over 1,000 classified documents. This act of civil disobedience would prove to be a pivotal moment in exposing the FBI's covert domestic operation. The stolen documents from the media office provided the first undeniable documentary evidence of the FBI's secret war against domestic political movements. Among the files were internal memos that explicitly detailed ongoing surveillance efforts, tactics for disrupting activist groups, and plans to exploit internal rivalries or discredit leaders. Crucially, some of these documents bore the acronym COINTELPRO, the official, albeit secret, designation for these legally dubious and ethically reprehensible FBI campaigns. The Citizens Commission, after carefully reviewing the stolen files, began leaking them to journalists. Despite initial reluctance from some major newspapers due to fears of government reprisal, the Washington Post, among others, began publishing excerpts from the COINTELPRO documents. For the first time, the American public saw concrete proof of widespread FBI abuses. The revelations were shocking and deeply unsettling, directly contradicting the Bureau's carefully crafted image. The FBI attempted to downplay this, but the documented evidence was compelling. The publication of the media documents ignited a firestorm of public debate and significantly increased pressure on Congress to investigate the full scope of the FBI's domestic intelligence activities and other potential abuses by intelligence agencies. Civil liberties organizations, legal scholars, and a growing number of elected officials began demanding accountability and a thorough examination of how such programs could have operated for so long, without detection or any meaningful oversight, too. This mounting pressure culminated in the formation of the U.S. Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities in 1975, famously known as the Church Committee, after its chairman, Senator Frank Church. While initially focused on CIA abuses, the Church Committee's mandate was broad enough to encompass the FBI's domestic operations. Particularly in light of the COINTELPRO revelations, the committee's investigation into COINTELPRO would become a central, vital part of its major work. The Church Committee's final report, released in 1976, delivered a damning indictment of COINTELPRO. It confirmed that from 1956 until its official termination in 1971, though some activities continued, the FBI had conducted a series of covert action programs aimed at surveilling, infiltrating, discrediting, and disrupting a wide range of domestic political organizations. The committee found that these programs often violated statutory law and constitutional rights and were frequently undertaken without any legitimate law enforcement or national security proper justification. While COINTELPRO initially targeted the Communist Party USA, its scope expanded dramatically over the years. The Church Committee revealed that the FBI had directed these covert operations against a vast array of groups and individuals, including the civil rights movement and its leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and the NAACP. Other targets included the Black Panther Party, anti-Vietnam War protesters, student activists of the New Left, feminist organizations, Native American movements, and even some white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, too. The tactics employed under COINTELPRO were insidious and varied. They included extensive electronic surveillance and warrantless wiretaps, infiltration by informants who often acted as agents provocateurs, psychological warfare such as forging correspondence to create rifts or sending anonymous letters to spouses to destroy marriages, spreading false rumors to the media, using the IRS for politically motivated tax audits, orchestrating false arrests and malicious prosecutions, and actively fomenting violence between rival groups, sometimes with truly deadly consequence. The FBI's campaign against Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was particularly egregious. It involved years of intense surveillance, bugging his hotel rooms, and concerted efforts to find and publicize information that could discredit him morally and politically. The FBI even sent King an anonymous, cruel letter suggesting he commit suicide. Similarly, COINTELPRO actions against the Black Panther Party were exceptionally aggressive, aiming to neutralize the organization through infiltration, misinformation, and encouraging violent confrontation. Many COINTELPRO tactics were blatantly illegal, violating fundamental First Amendment rights to free speech and association, Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, and Fifth Amendment rights to due process. The Church Committee concluded that the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover's autocratic leadership had operated with a no-holds-barred mentality, often viewing dissent itself as a threat to be neutralized rather than a legitimate expression of cherished democratic right. The public revelations about COINTELPRO were profoundly shocking to many Americans. The image of the FBI as an impartial enforcer of the law was shattered, replaced by a picture of a secretive agency that had actively worked to undermine legitimate political movements. This exposure led to a significant decline in public trust in the FBI and, more broadly, in government institutions. The realization that federal law enforcement had engaged in such widespread abuses against its own citizens was a sobering and truly disillusioning moment for the entire nation indeed. Tonight we delve into a seismic event in American history, a moment when years of growing public suspicion about the Vietnam War were validated in the most dramatic fashion, the leaking and publication of the Pentagon Papers. This wasn't a conspiracy theory in the traditional sense, but rather a widespread, gnawing doubt that the U.S. government was being truthful about its longest, most divisive war. The Pentagon Papers transformed this suspicion into undeniable, documented fact, revealing a profound and systematic deception of the American people and Congress by successive administrations. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Vietnam War had deeply fractured American society, the conflict was escalating, U.S. casualties were mounting, and a powerful anti-war movement was gaining momentum. A significant factor fueling this dissent was the widening credibility gap, the stark difference between optimistic official pronouncements about progress and the grim realities reported by journalists and experienced by soldiers. This chasm bred deep mistrust and a sense the public was not being told the whole truth. Public suspicion about the government's handling and portrayal of the Vietnam War was not unfounded. Official reports often painted a picture of steady progress, yet events like the 1968 Tet Offensive starkly contradicted these claims, revealing the enemy's continued strength. Many Americans began to question the war's necessity, its aims, its morality, and whether sacrifices were based on truthful assessments from their leaders. This profound skepticism was the fertile ground for the eventual impact of the Pentagon Papers documents. For years, successive U.S. administrations from Truman and Eisenhower through Kennedy and Johnson had presented a relatively consistent narrative to the public regarding Vietnam. They framed involvement as necessary to contain communism under the domino theory, to protect South Vietnam, and to uphold American credibility. Official statements frequently emphasized U.S. restraint, limited objectives, and an optimistic outlook, even as the war quietly and steadily expanded in scope and its human cost mounted significantly. What the public and most of Congress did not know was that internally, within the government, assessments of the war were often far more pessimistic and U.S. actions far more extensive than publicly admitted. Policy discussions acknowledged the difficulties, the limited prospects for clear victory, and the potential for a long, costly stalemate. It was this disconnect between internal understanding and the managed public narrative that led to the commissioning of the study that would become the Pentagon Papers, a secret internal accounting. In June 1967, then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, privately disillusioned with the war he had helped escalate, commissioned a top-secret internal history of United States involvement in Vietnam. The official title, United States-Vietnam Relations 1945-1967, a study prepared by the Department of Defense. This monumental work, compiled by dozens of analysts, consisted of 47 volumes, 3,000 pages of narrative history, and 4,000 pages of original government documents. It was intended as an unvarnished account for internal eyes. One of the individuals who worked on this classified study was Daniel Ellsberg, a former Marine officer and a respected military analyst with the RAND Corporation, who had also served in Vietnam. Initially a supporter of U.S. involvement, Ellsberg's experiences and his work on the Pentagon Papers study led to a profound disillusionment. He came to believe the war was unwinnable, and more critically, that successive U.S. administrations had systematically lied to the American public about the true nature, extent, and justifications for the brutal war. Driven by his growing moral opposition to the war and his conviction that the American people had a right to know the truth, Daniel Ellsberg made the momentous and perilous decision to leak the Pentagon Papers. He hoped that exposing the decades of government deception would inform public debate, increase pressure to end the devastating war, and prevent future presidents from misleading the country into similar conflicts. Ellsberg understood the severe personal and legal risks involved, including possible lengthy prison sentences. Beginning in late 1969, Ellsberg, with the help of his former RAND colleague Anthony Russo, undertook the clandestine and painstaking task of photocopying the thousands of pages that made up the Pentagon Papers. This was done secretly, often at night, using a Xerox machine at a friend's advertising agency. It was a high-stakes operation, requiring meticulous care to avoid detection while handling highly classified government documents. Over several months, they managed to create multiple copies of a significant portion of the 47-volume historical study. Before deciding to leak the documents directly to the press, Daniel Ellsberg first attempted to work through official channels. He approached several prominent U.S. senators who were known critics of the Vietnam War, including J. William Fulbright, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, hoping they would release the papers publicly or hold official hearings. However, these efforts proved unsuccessful. While sympathetic, the senators were hesitant to take on the immense political and legal risks associated with releasing such highly classified materials. Frustrated by the lack of action from Congress, Ellsberg turned to the media. In early 1971, he provided a substantial portion of the copied Pentagon Papers to Neil Sheehan, a reporter for the New York Times who had covered the Vietnam War extensively. After months of careful review, verification, and intense internal debate about the potential legal and national security implications, the editors of the New York Times made the courageous decision to begin publishing articles based on the classified study. The first installment appeared on Sunday, June 13, 1971. The New York Times articles, published over several days, revealed a secret history of the Vietnam War that was far different from the official story, shocking the nation. They detailed how U.S. involvement had deepened through a series of covert actions, miscalculations, and deliberate escalations, often hidden from the public. For many Americans, particularly those in the anti-war movement or those deeply suspicious of government pronouncements, the Pentagon Papers provided stunning confirmation of their worst fears: systematic deception about a costly war. The Nixon administration reacted with fury to the publication of the Pentagon Papers, viewing it as a dangerous breach of national security that could undermine the ongoing war effort and delicate diplomatic initiatives. Attorney General John Mitchell, citing national security concerns, demanded that the New York Times cease further publication. When the Times refused, the Justice Department sought a court injunction to halt publication, arguing it would cause irreparable harm. This was a rare attempt by the government to impose prior restraint on the free press. What followed was a dramatic legal battle. A federal court initially granted a temporary restraining order against the New York Times. During this period, Daniel Ellsberg leaked copies of the papers to other news organizations, most notably the Washington Post, which also began publishing important articles. The Nixon administration then sought injunctions against the Post and other papers as well. The cases quickly made their way through the court system, culminating in a landmark hearing before the U.S. Supreme Court. On June 3, 1971, in a historic 6-3 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of the New York Times and the Washington Post, affirming the newspaper's First Amendment right to publish the Pentagon Papers. The court found the government had failed to meet the heavy burden of proof required to justify prior restraint. Justice Hugo Black, in his concurring opinion, famously wrote, "Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government." This ruling was a major victory for press freedom and public access. The Pentagon Papers revealed a multitude of uncomfortable truths. They showed that the U.S. had deliberately expanded the scope of its military actions in Vietnam, including bombing campaigns in Laos and Cambodia, long before it was publicly acknowledged. They documented how multiple administrations had consistently misrepresented U.S. motives and prospects for success, often expressing private pessimism while publicly radiating false confidence. Perhaps most damningly, they demonstrated a clear pattern of presidents systematically misleading the American public and the U.S. Congress. Tonight, our journey into the shadowed corridors of history brings us to a single, cataclysmic event that became a crucial stepping stone in the Nazi Party's terrifying ascent to absolute power: the Reichstag fire. On the night of February 27, 1933, the German Parliament building in Berlin was engulfed in flames, its destruction dramatically illuminating a nation's descent into darkness. The Nazis immediately blamed communists, but a persistent theory, a dark counter-narrative, suggested a more sinister origin, that the Nazis themselves had staged or exploited the fire. This is the story of that fateful night. To grasp the significance of the Reichstag fire, we must understand the precarious state of Germany in early 1933. Adolf Hitler had been appointed Chancellor on January 30th, just 4 weeks prior, but the Nazis did not yet have complete control. The Weimar Republic, Germany's first democracy, was fragile, battered by economic depression and extreme political polarization. New elections were scheduled for March 5th, and the Nazi Party was desperate to secure a decisive majority, eliminate its powerful communist and socialist opposition, and establish a totalitarian regime. This fire offered a golden opportunity. On that cold February night, flames and smoke billowed from the magnificent Reichstag building. Firefighters rushed to the scene, battling the blaze that was gutting the main chamber. Inside the burning structure, authorities quickly apprehended a young, disoriented Dutch council communist named Marinus van der Lubbe. He had flammable materials on his person and readily admitted to starting fires. Van der Lubbe, a former bricklayer with a history of radical activism, became the face of alleged communist terror, a seemingly open and shut case for the authorities. The Nazi leadership, including Hitler and Hermann Goering, arrived at the scene quickly. They immediately and vociferously proclaimed the fire to be the work of communists, a signal for a planned nationwide communist uprising and revolution, a Red Terror. This swift, unwavering accusation by top Nazis shaped the immediate public understanding. This narrative was aggressively pushed through Nazi-controlled newspapers and radio broadcasts, designed to instill widespread fear and panic among the German populace and to create an atmosphere of national emergency demanding swift action. The Nazi exploitation of the fire was astonishingly swift and effective. The very next day, February 28, 1933, an emergency decree, formally titled the Decree of the President of the Reich for the Protection of People and State, was promulgated by President Paul von Hindenburg at Hitler's urging. Commonly known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, it suspended fundamental civil liberties guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution, including freedom of speech, press, assembly, and privacy of communication. Thousands were arrested that night, their basic human rights extinguished by this decree. Almost immediately, however, suspicions arose about the official Nazi version of events. Critics and opponents of the Nazi regime, both within Germany and abroad, began to question whether Marinus van der Lubbe had acted alone, or if he was merely a pawn in a much larger, more sinister Nazi plot. The theory that the Nazis themselves had orchestrated the fire, or at least had a hand in it, began to gain currency. The timing, just before crucial elections, was remarkably fortuitous for Hitler's party, suggesting a deliberately staged provocation. Several factors fueled this alternative theory. Firstly, the fire provided an almost unbelievably convenient pretext for the Nazis to implement repressive measures they had long desired. The speed and preparedness of their response, including having lists of political opponents ready for mass arrests, seemed suspicious. Such rapid, targeted action hinted at foreknowledge, if not direct involvement. Many doubted that van der Lubbe, with his limited resources, could have single-handedly set such a large and widespread fire in the massive Reichstag building so quickly. Early proponents of the Nazi culpability theory included exiled German communists and socialists, critical international journalists, and anti-Nazi intellectuals. They quickly compiled and disseminated evidence suggesting a setup. One notable effort was the Brown Book of the Hitler Terror and the Burning of the Reichstag, published by a Comintern-backed group. This book argued forcefully that the Nazis, likely elements of the SA or SS under Goering's direction, were the true arsonists, using van der Lubbe as a scapegoat, painting a picture of a meticulously planned Nazi provocation. In September 1933, Mironis Vanderloob and 4 other communists, including the prominent Bulgarian Comintern leader Georgy Dimitrov, were put on trial in Leipzig for the Reichstag fire. The trial was intended by the Nazis to be a showpiece, definitively proving communist guilt. This public spectacle, meant to cement the communist threat, proved somewhat counterproductive. Vanderloob was convicted and later executed. But Georgy Dimitrov mounted a brilliant defense, exposing contradictions and embarrassing Nazi officials. The other 3 communists were acquitted. For many decades following World War II, the historical debate over responsibility for the Reichstag fire continued. Many mainstream Western historians, particularly in the 1960s, tended to support the view that Mironis Vanderloob was indeed the sole arsonist, acting on his own initiative. This interpretation often downplayed the sophistication and ruthlessness of early Nazi tactics, suggesting that the Nazis, while ruthlessly exploiting the event, did not instigate it. This perspective often dismissed Nazi conspiracy theories as lacking definitive proof. However, the historical consensus began to shift over subsequent decades, particularly from the late 20th century onwards. New research, the discovery of previously unavailable archival materials, re-examination of existing evidence, and changing historiographical approaches led many historians to reconsider the possibility of direct Nazi involvement. This shift was driven by fresh perspectives and a deeper dive into available complex evidence concerning the events of that fateful night and the subsequent Nazi power grab, challenging long-held assumptions. Several pieces of evidence lend credence to theories of Nazi complicity. Some experts have argued that the sheer speed and extent of the fire suggests the use of accelerants and multiple points of ignition, possibly beyond the capability of a single individual like Vanderloob. There were also some contemporaneous, albeit sometimes contested, eyewitness accounts and later testimonies hinting at SA presence near the Reichstag tunnels. The logistical challenges for a lone, unaided arsonist in such a vast building also fuel considerable doubt among researchers. It's important to acknowledge that the debate is not entirely settled, and definitive, irrefutable proof of a direct order from Hitler or Goering to burn the Reichstag remains elusive. Some historians continue to argue forcefully for Vanderloob's sole culpability, emphasizing his own confessions. They suggest the Nazis were brilliant opportunists. The truth is likely layered, involving Nazi opportunism at minimum and perhaps far more sinister acts of direct involvement in the arson itself, further complicated by the destruction of many relevant documents. Regardless of who precisely started the fire, whether it was Vanderloob alone, Vanderloob assisted, or Nazis acting alone or with him, one fact is historically undeniable. The Nazi regime exploited the Reichstag fire with breathtaking speed and brutality. The fire was the spark, but the Nazi response was the inferno that consumed German democracy. They used it as the perfect pretext to dismantle civil liberties, crush political opposition, and create a climate of fear and emergency that paved the way for their totalitarian dictatorship. Today, while the lone arsonist theory for Mironis Vanderloob still has some scholarly adherents, a significant number of historians lean heavily towards the view that the Nazis were, at the very least, complicit in some manner. This perspective suggests the Nazis were far more than passive beneficiaries of a convenient accident. This could range from knowing about Vanderloob's intentions and allowing the fire to proceed, to facilitating his entry, to having their own agents' assistants spreading the blaze to ensure maximum political impact. The Reichstag fire and the subsequent emergency decree were pivotal moments. They effectively neutralized the Communist Party and severely hampered other opposition parties in the run-up to the March 1933 elections. While the Nazis still didn't win an absolute majority, the crippled opposition and atmosphere of crisis allowed them, with nationalist allies, to pass the Enabling Act on March 23, 1933. This act granted Hitler dictatorial power, effectively marking the legal end of the Weimar Republic. Its ashes became the foundation for a 12-year reign of terror. Tonight, our exploration of hidden histories takes us to the jungles of Vietnam and the long, painful aftermath of a chemical deployed in warfare, Agent Orange. For decades, a theory persisted among returning U.S. veterans, a deeply personal and often dismissed claim that their exposure to this defoliant was causing severe health problems for them and their children. What was once officially denied or downplayed has, through years of tenacious struggle, scientific inquiry, and legal battles, been largely confirmed as a tragic truth. This is the story of that chemical cover-up and the arduous fight for recognition and justice by those affected. The Vietnam War, a conflict defined by guerrilla warfare and dense jungle terrain, presented unique challenges to the U.S. military. To counter the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army's use of forest cover for ambushes, supply lines, and base camps, and to destroy enemy food crops, the U.S. embarked on a massive chemical defoliation program. This operation, codenamed Operation Ranch Hand, ran from 1962 to 1971. The motto of the Ranch Hand cruise, starkly, was "Only you can prevent forests," a grim twist on a popular environmental slogan, highlighting the mission's destructive intent. The most widely used and now most infamous of the herbicides deployed was Agent Orange, so named for the orange stripe on the 55-gallon drums in which it was shipped and stored. It was a potent mixture, roughly 50/50, of two herbicides, 24-dichlorophenoxyacetic acid, and 245-dichlorophenoxyacetic acid. It is between 1962 and 1971 an estimated 19 million gallons of various herbicides, the vast majority being Agent Orange, were sprayed over millions of acres of South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia by low-flying aircraft and ground dispensers, often drenching troops below. Unbeknownst to most of the soldiers handling and being exposed to Agent Orange, and certainly to the wider public at the time, the 245T component was contaminated during its manufacturing process with a highly toxic and persistent compound, 2,378 tetrachloro-dibenzopd-dioxin, or TCDD. Commonly known as dioxin, dioxin is one of the most potent carcinogens and teratogens known to science. The initial awareness of this contamination and its extreme toxicity was either limited, actively suppressed, or deliberately downplayed by chemical manufacturers and certain government agencies involved in its procurement and deployment. Soon after returning from Vietnam, and increasingly throughout the 1970s, veterans began reporting a disturbing array of health problems. These included persistent skin rashes and sores, some later identified as chloracne, a hallmark of dioxin exposure, various forms of aggressive cancers, debilitating neurological disorders, severe psychological issues, and, heartbreakingly, a high incidence of miscarriages in their spouses and devastating birth defects in their children. Initially, these claims were largely dismissed by the Department of Veterans Affairs, VA, as anecdotal, stress, or entirely unrelated to their wartime service. The official stance of the U.S. government, particularly the VA and the Department of Defense, for many long years was that there was no conclusive scientific evidence linking exposure to Agent Orange to the diverse health problems being reported by veterans. Chemical companies that manufactured Agent Orange, such as Dow Chemical and Monsanto, also strongly denied that their product, as used, was responsible for the illnesses. This formidable wall of denial left veterans feeling abandoned, betrayed, and forced to fight for recognition of their suffering against powerful institutional and corporate interests. For individual veterans and their families, the battle for recognition and compensation was an arduous, emotionally draining, and often isolating one. Proving a direct causal link between a specific illness and Agent Orange exposure decades earlier, especially with limited or missing medical records from the chaotic war zone and no baseline health data, was an immense scientific and legal challenge. Many veterans faced skepticism from doctors, endless bureaucratic hurdles at the VA, and the toll of battling illnesses while also fighting for basic acknowledgement of their wartime sacrifices. Despite the official denials, the theory that Agent Orange was indeed the cause of these widespread health issues began to solidify into a movement. The sheer number of veterans reporting similar patterns of rare cancers and other debilitating conditions, often unique to their service cohort, was too significant to ignore. Independent scientists and concerned physicians started to conduct their own research, finding correlations that supported the veterans' claims. Grassroots activism, fueled by personal stories of suffering and a profound sense of injustice, played a critical role in keeping the issue in the public eye. While less publicly documented than in some other scandals, there were instances of internal concerns being raised about the safety of 245T and its dioxin contaminant, even before and during its widespread use in Vietnam. Some scientists within government agencies and military personnel reportedly voiced unease about the potential long-term health effects of such massive herbicide spraying operations on both friendly forces and civilian populations. However, the perceived military necessity of the defoliation program during wartime often overshadowed these cautionary voices, delaying critical action. The fight for Agent Orange recognition was a true David versus Goliath struggle. Veterans found themselves pitted against not only the U.S. government and its vast resources, but also against some of the largest and most powerful chemical corporations in the world. These entities had significant legal teams, scientific consultants, and public relations machinery dedicated to refuting the claims of harm and deflecting responsibility. Overcoming this combined institutional and corporate resistance required extraordinary persistence, unwavering courage, and a growing body of undeniable scientific evidence. The tide began to turn, albeit slowly, with the publication of increasingly robust scientific studies throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Research conducted by independent scientists and later by government-mandated bodies like the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine started to establish statistically significant associations between exposure to Agent Orange and dioxin and a growing list of specific diseases. These studies meticulously analyzed epidemiological data, animal toxicology reports, and cellular mechanisms of dioxin's effects, providing crucial scientific support. As scientific evidence mounted, the Department of Veterans Affairs was gradually compelled to acknowledge these links, moving away from outright denial. Over several years and decades, a list of presumptive diseases associated with Agent Orange exposure was established. This meant that if a veteran who served in Vietnam developed one of these conditions, it would be presumed to be service-connected, making them eligible for VA benefits. Conditions like chloracne, soft tissue sarcomas, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, Hodgkin's disease, respiratory cancers, prostate cancer, Parkinson's disease, and type 2 diabetes were eventually included. Beyond the scientific front, a major legal battle was waged. In 1979, a class action lawsuit was filed by Vietnam veterans against the 7 chemical companies that manufactured Agent Orange. After years of complex and contentious litigation, a settlement was reached out of court in 1984, just hours before the trial was due to begin. The chemical companies agreed to create a $180 million zero-cents fund to compensate affected veterans and their families. However, the companies did not admit liability, and the settlement amount was seen by many veterans as deeply insufficient given the scale of the harm. Despite the 1984 settlement, many veterans and their advocates felt that justice had not been fully served. The compensation from the fund was often modest, and new illnesses continued to emerge that veterans believed were linked to their exposure, leading to further claims and appeals. The fight for more comprehensive recognition, expanded benefits, and research into the intergenerational effects of Agent Orange continued relentlessly. Veterans groups lobbied Congress, held protests, and shared their harrowing stories, ensuring that the issue remained a matter of national concern. A significant legislative victory came with the passage of the Agent Orange Act of 1991. This landmark law acknowledged that the 1984 settlement had not provided a comprehensive solution and that the scientific understanding of Agent Orange's effects was still evolving. It established a formal process through which the Secretary of Veterans Affairs would review scientific evidence from the National Academy of Sciences and other sources to determine which diseases should be considered presumptively caused by Agent Orange exposure, creating a pathway for expanding the list of recognized conditions. The legacy of Agent Orange is a long and painful one, etched into the lives of hundreds of thousands of U.S. veterans and their families who continue to deal with a litany of health issues and the specter of intergenerational harm. The impact also extends profoundly to the Vietnamese people and the environment of Vietnam. For America, it stands as a stark symbol of the unanticipated and often devastating long-term human costs of warfare, the profound responsibility a government has to its soldiers, and the consequences of deploying toxic substances without full knowledge or disclosure of their effects. Tonight, our journey into the annals of confirmed conspiracies takes us into the intricate and often shadowy world of international finance. We explore the rise and catastrophic fall of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI. For years, whispers and wild speculation painted BCCI not as a legitimate financial institution, but as a vast clandestine empire involved in myriad illicit activity. What seemed like an outlandish theory eventually unraveled into one of the most complex and far-reaching financial frauds in history, a tale of deception on a truly global scale which deeply shocked the entire world. BCCI was founded in 1972 by a charismatic Pakistani financier named Aga Hassan Abedi. Its stated mission was ambitious and seemingly noble: to create a powerful international bank headquartered in the developing world, catering to the financial needs of nations and individuals often overlooked or underserved by established Western banking institutions. Abedi envisioned BCCI as a symbol of third world financial independence, and a very potent challenger to the dominance of traditional European and American banks. From its inception, BCCI was structured in a uniquely complex and deliberately opaque manner. It was nominally headquartered in Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands, two jurisdictions known for their strict bank secrecy laws and minimal regulatory oversight. Its operations, however, spanned over 70 countries, with a labyrinthine network of branches, subsidiaries, affiliates, and offshore entities. This decentralized structure was specifically designed to make the bank often incredibly difficult for any single national regulatory authority to supervise or fully comprehend its activities. Despite its public image of a dynamic bank empowering the developing world, rumors, and more pointed theories, about BCCI's darker side began to circulate within international financial and intelligence circles fairly early in its existence. These whispers suggested that BCCI was more than just a bank. It was allegedly a key financial conduit for a range of illicit activities, including laundering money for drug traffickers, financing international arms deals, facilitating capital flight for corrupt officials, and even providing many diverse financial services to terrorist organizations. A crucial element of BCCI's operational strategy, and a reason for its ability to deflect scrutiny for so long, was its systematic cultivation of powerful and influential allies around the globe. Aga Hassan Abedi and other BCCI executives actively courted politicians, high-ranking government officials, intelligence figures, and prominent businessmen. They offered lavish perks, generous loans, employment for relatives, and discreet financial services. This deeply entrenched network of well-placed friends provided BCCI with a shield of respectability and vital political protection. As BCCI's global footprint expanded rapidly throughout the 1000s, 970s, and 1980s, various national regulatory bodies and law enforcement agencies did begin to take notice of its unusual operations and the persistent rumors surrounding it. However, their attempts to investigate were often stymied. BCCI's complex offshore structure made it exceedingly difficult to trace transactions or obtain comprehensive financial records. Furthermore, the bank's political connections meant that official inquiries could often be quietly discouraged or actively obstructed by powerful figures. The wall of secrecy around BCCI began to show cracks due to the courage of internal whistleblowers and the persistence of investigative journalists. Individuals who had worked within BCCI and became aware of its criminal activities started to come forward, often at great personal risk, providing insider accounts and crucial documentation to authorities or the press. Simultaneously, a few tenacious reporters began to dig into BCCI's affairs, publishing exposés that, while initially met with skepticism, started to paint a very detailed and disturbing picture of its actual operations. A significant early breakthrough in exposing BCCI's criminal enterprise came from the United States. In the mid-1980s, a U.S. Customs Service undercover investigation codenamed Operation Chase, based in Tampa, Florida, successfully infiltrated BCCI's money laundering operations. This sting operation provided concrete evidence that BCCI was actively involved in laundering millions of dollars in drug profits for Colombia's notorious Medellin cartel led by Pablo Escobar. The indictments from Chase were a final major blow to BCCI's. Despite the damning evidence from Operation Chase and other emerging investigations, many in the financial world and in positions of power found it difficult to believe the full extent of the allegations against BCCI. It was, after all, one of the world's largest privately owned banks, with prominent figures on its boards and among its clientele. Some often dismissed the accusations as isolated incidents of misconduct by rogue employees or even as politically motivated attacks aimed at undermining a successful third-world banking institution. Investigators gradually came to understand that BCCI operated as a bank within a bank. Outwardly, it presented itself as a legitimate, if somewhat unconventional, commercial bank serving its diverse global customers. However, concealed within this structure was a clandestine parallel operation, a sort of criminal subsidiary known to insiders as the Black Network. This very secret inner bank was allegedly dedicated to handling illicit transactions, falsifying records, and providing the specialized financial services required by its criminal clientele. The edifice of deception finally came crashing down on July 5, 1991. In a coordinated sweep, bank regulators in the United Kingdom, the United States, Luxembourg, the Cayman Islands, and several other countries simultaneously moved to seize BCCI's assets and shut down its operations worldwide. This dramatic global action was triggered by mounting, irrefutable evidence of massive, systemic fraud that threatened the stability of the international financial system. For many hundreds of thousands of ordinary depositors, it was a day of absolute shock and great fear. The catalyst for the coordinated global shutdown was a damning report commissioned by the Bank of England from the accounting firm Pricewaterhouse. This audit, based on access to some of BCCI's closely guarded internal records, confirmed investigators' worst fears. It detailed a staggering level of fraud, false accounting, unrecorded deposits, and massive, unrecoverable loans that had been deeply hidden for many years through a complex web of deception The report painted a picture of a bank rotten to its very core. Subsequent investigations and legal proceedings confirmed the mind-boggling array of BCCI's illicit activities. It was proven to have laundered vast sums of money for international drug traffickers like the Medellin cartel, terrorist organizations such as the Abu Nidal organization, and corrupt dictators like Manuel Noriega of Panama and Saddam Hussein of Iraq. The bank was also deeply involved in facilitating illegal arms trafficking, widespread bribery of government officials worldwide, and even provided services for many various intelligence agencies. The scale of the financial fraud perpetrated by BCCI was unprecedented at the time, estimated to be in the tens of billions of dollars. Hundreds of thousands of depositors, many of them small businesses, ordinary individuals, and even entire municipalities from developing countries, lost their savings when the bank collapsed. The human cost was immense, with life savings wiped out, businesses ruined, and livelihoods destroyed. The collapse sent often damaging shockwaves through the global financial system. The BCCI scandal reached into the highest echelons of power and influence globally. Investigations revealed that numerous prominent politicians, government officials, intelligence operatives, and influential businessmen had connections to the bank, either as witting or unwitting participants in its schemes or as recipients of its generous largesse. Figures like former U.S. Defense Secretary Clark Clifford faced intense scrutiny. The scandal deeply tainted many reputations and raised uncomfortable questions about elite corruption. The aftermath of BCCI's collapse saw a flurry of legal actions across multiple jurisdictions. Numerous BCCI officials, including its founder Aga Hassan Abadi, though he died before he could be fully prosecuted by some key jurisdictions, were indicted. Some executives were arrested, convicted, and served prison sentences. The complex and lengthy international liquidation process was initiated to try and recover some of the billions lost by depositors, but this proved often incredibly challenging, with only a fraction of losses ever recouped by the numerous victims. And so our quiet, nocturnal journey through the more unsettling chapters of verifiable history draws to a close for tonight. We've navigated a landscape where events once dismissed as crazy conspiracy theories were, in time, revealed to be stark, documented reality. From clandestine government programs that manipulated media or experimented on citizens to global financial frauds and medical betrayals conducted under veils of secrecy, the stories we've explored share a common, deeply disquieting thread. Truth, when powerful entities wish to conceal it, can be a most elusive quarry, often stranger and more disturbing than any fiction we might imagine. It's understandable why such narratives are often met with initial disbelief, even ridicule. We inherently seek order and rationality in the world. We want to believe that institutions charged with our welfare operate with integrity and transparency. The idea that these same institutions might engage in deception, manipulation, or outright harm on a grand scale is profoundly unsettling. It challenges our fundamental assumptions about power and governance. Thus, labeling such claims as theories can be a defense mechanism, a way to preserve a more comfortable, if less accurate, view of how the world ultimately operates behind closed doors. Looking back at the historical accounts we've touched upon, distinct patterns emerge. The abuse of power, often rationalized by appeals to national security, ideological imperatives, or simply unchecked ambition, is a recurring theme. Secrecy is the lifeblood of these operations, shielding them from public scrutiny and accountability for years, sometimes decades. We see the vulnerability of ordinary citizens when pitted against the resources and authority of the state or powerful private interests. And perhaps most importantly, we witness the immense quiet courage and persistence required from individuals to bring these hidden truths into the light. The revelation of these once hidden events is rarely a sudden, dramatic unveiling. More often, the truth emerges painstakingly, piece by piece, over an extended period. It requires the bravery of whistleblowers who risk their careers and reputations, the tenacity of investigative journalists who pursue leads against official resistance, the diligence of historians and researchers who conduct patient sifting through archives, and sometimes the slow, deliberate process of declassification as governments are eventually compelled to open their records. Each confirmed theory is often the culmination of years of such arduous, dedicated work. A healthy skepticism, as we've noted, is indeed a crucial tool for navigating an information-saturated world. It prompts us to question, to seek evidence, and to avoid falling prey to baseless speculation or misinformation. However, the stories we've explored tonight also remind us that skepticism must be a double-edged sword. It should not only always be applied to outlandish claims from the fringes, but also at times to official narratives, especially when those narratives seem to contradict observable facts or when power seeks to operate without transparency. true skepticism questions all assumptions. And in those remarkable instances when years of suspicion, investigation, and finally concrete evidence converge, something extraordinary happens. The line between what was once a conspiracy theory and what becomes dull, verifiable history simply vanishes. The once dismissed claim is now an indelible chapter in textbooks, a subject of academic study, a sobering case study in governmental or institutional behavior. It becomes part of our collective memory, a reminder that the official version of events is not always the complete or even the true version. History itself is the ultimate judge. The legacy of these uncovered truths is complex and often unsettling. They can lead to vital reforms in laws, oversight mechanisms, and ethical guidelines as societies attempt to prevent such abuses from recurring. However, they also invariably leave behind an enduring residue of cynicism and diminished public trust in institutions. This erosion of faith, while an understandable consequence of deception, can itself be problematic. The ongoing challenge is to foster institutions that are genuinely accountable and transparent, thereby earning, rather than simply demanding, the public's confidence. So as the night deepens and you prepare to drift into sleep, let these reflections settle gently. The history we've explored, while perhaps unsettling, also carries a quiet affirmation that truth, however deeply buried, has a persistent way of always surfacing. It reminds us that not every crazy theory is without some foundation, and that questioning is a fundamental human endeavor. May your dreams be untroubled by classified documents or shadowy organizations. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the more obscure corners of our shared past. Sleep well and question thoughtfully.